I put out a video recently about a specific kind of barrier, and turns out y'all wanted to hear about something completely different. So let's talk about this too. Final Fantasy XIV is a surprisingly easy game to get into, and by getting into, I mean of course making a free trial account, downloading the game, making a character, and getting into the world to play. In fact, with the free trial being available on Steam, it almost cannot get any easier than that. Not to mention, the free trial includes nearly all of the content of 3 out of 5 expansions to the game. There's arguably more free content than there is paid content. And the free trial has no time limit either. What is there not to like? Well, that's what this video is about, and there are a few different sized barriers that can stop a player. So let's get started with buying the game. Well, not even remotely the greatest barrier. This one comes up often enough to not be glossed over. Assuming you're not accessing the option to purchase or perhaps even start a trial account through some other means like Steam, you have to contend with the official MogStation website, which, despite having received updates, still feels like taking a portal back to like 2008. Which is weird, since 14's first official version was like 2010. It's not super clear to a new player what you need to buy and what is entirely optional, and this confusion can already stop a potential new player before they even set their foot in Eorzea. And speaking of Eorzea, that conveniently leads us to probably the actually biggest barrier to entry: the mandatory main scenario quest. Most story-based games logically have a main story to follow, sometimes with branching paths that gives the player a clear way forward to progress in the game, to make sure they keep being met with new challenges, gaining new abilities, and having opportunities to utilize them. In this, 14 is no different, with the main issue that we usually point to being how incredibly long it is, which, weirdly for a lot of games, would have been a selling point and not a detriment. 300 plus hours of core story gameplay. If it is all good stuff, then that should be perfect, right? That heavily depends on what kind of player you are. A lot of RPG, or more specifically MMORPG players, are likely to be perfectly fine with, or even happy with, having a main quest to follow where they know, as long as they do this, they are developing their character in a meaningful way, even if the task is a bit boring. However, I imagine for most of us, there is a limit to how much grinding we're willing to do, just for that. Assuming you enjoy the story itself, then there being 300 plus hours of main quest to do is a huge win. But in the situation where you don't actually enjoy the story, or perhaps you lost interest, even if you can maybe cut the length in half by skipping dialogue, that's still a lot of mandatory tasks to unlock, perhaps what you actually came for. Even if 14's almost entirely single-player story can be a big selling point for the game, let's not forget that the main core selling point is that this is an MMORPG. A lot of players come to the game for that, and as someone who has played this game for years and very much love it, I'll be the first to admit that if I wanted specifically a story-focused game, I would probably just have bought a single-player story-focused game instead. Which is the reason why 14's MSQ, even for players that enjoy the story, becomes the biggest barrier to entry for the game. Other competing MMOs either don't have a mandatory main quest, only require you to do the newest part, and otherwise lets you speed level up to the new bit. This can of course leave you extremely confused and lost in regards to the story, which itself can be a bit of a quit moment. 14 instead requires that every character must go through the story to unlock everything, with the express exception that you can buy story and level skips for cash. But for the kind of player that just wanted to get to the good bit, that itself can be a quit moment too. I just bought the game. Now you want more money to just allow me to skip to the good part? The issue mainly stems from the fact that the MSQ is the main wall that unlocks everything in some form or another. Either quest in the MSQ literally unlocks access to some other content, or the only way to reach a specific zone where some unlock exists is by following the MSQ. For a solo player coming into 14 with little to no expectations, this can be great since it means the game unfolds itself bit by bit instead of overwhelming the player with options, which also can be a reason to give up. At the same time, if that player came to 14 for the multiplayer elements, they would probably be very confused by the sheer percentage of solo content. Not just content you can do alone, but content the game requires that you do alone. That the game leads with for the first many levels. This gets a lot worse if you're getting into the game to play with friends who focus on battle content. You could team up with your friends for proper, harder level 50 content like Extremes or the Coils of Bahamut. You just first have to reach and beat Porta de Gomana, which, if you're really fast, which a new player is probably not, could take you maybe 12 hours. If you really take your time, this could easily take you 50. The age-old, it gets good after 100 hours problem. Why not just play something that is good from the start? But this is where 14 runs into a problem. First and foremost, a lot of players enjoy the story, including new players that had to wade through all 300 plus hours of it. And while paying to skip this story is an option, this is, to my knowledge, mainly done by players that either don't care about the story outright, have already completed the story and this is an alt, or someone who just really wanted to catch up to their friends quickly and might play through the story on a different character. Suggesting huge swathes of the story must get canned because it's too long now isn't really a solution either. While there's a lot of it, doesn't mean the story suddenly became irrelevant now. For a bit of a more, perhaps, dramatic tangent, these suggestions of freely allowing new characters to skip huge parts of the story to skip to the good bit are sometimes met with a response a bit like, why does the game need to be changed to fit the desires of players that clearly don't want to play the game anyway? With the emphasis that the story is part of the experience. The reason I find this very fascinating is that every time jobs get changes that make them easier to play, the exact same sentiment comes out. Why do these jobs need to be changed to fit the desires of players that clearly don't want to play them anyway? I think this is fascinating because while there is obviously overlap, hardcore players that do the hard content and enjoy the story, I do find it more common that the hardcore dedicated Savage Raiders complain about the simplifications of jobs, while the more heavily story-invested players complain about the suggestion that the story should get squished. In both cases, in very different ways, the simplification or squishing both are suggested or outright done to make the thing in question more approachable, such that more people might get invested in the thing, such that the amount of people that care about that particular thing increases. Getting back on topic then. Personally, I think there is a middle ground to be had. Even with the removal of some entirely filler MSQ tasks, as has been done in the past, there are still very filler quests in the story. A way to make this kind of area less of a problem could be to offer ways for players to choose a shorter version. Let's say a story spanning 10 quests ultimately boiled down to you arrived at town, you helped a bunch of people with random stuff, then the town gets attacked, leading to a solo duty or a dungeon, allowing less story-invested players to simply take the shortcut of and then the Warrior of Light helped a bunch of people, with the clear indication that you will miss out on details, perhaps even some MSQ XP. Lets players choose how invested they are. Such a skip option could also only be present in old MSQ content to help shorten the old stuff a bit. The main concern of an option like this is that a lot of players might, emphasis on might, feel compelled to choose the skip option since it does take less time, and if the game offers the skip, then that bit of story can't possibly be that important now, can it? Which is also a main concern of if the game one day got the option to skip to either the newest expansion or one expansion before that. If the game offers this option free of charge, why wouldn't you pick it? Surely the developers have determined the story before that isn't important enough to require it. Now, whether this kind of concern justifies avoiding such an option is quite a heated debate, and I'm not here to tell you all what is the right or wrong answer. I don't know! Another option could be to allow players access to zones they haven't actually reached in the story yet. If their level is high enough, access raids as long as their level is sufficient, allow access to gear vendors as long as their level is high enough. While this would still require you to level up to access everything, let's just say hitting level 100 from level 1 takes far less than 300 hours, especially if you're efficient about it. This would of course cause some story continuity issues of its own, but I have a feeling most players that would run into this would be perfectly clear on this fact. Besides, there's plenty enough story continuity issues with all the side quests where, when things stop making sense, you just have to remind yourself of where in the MSQ the side quest assumes you are. The quests could simply let you know roughly where it is in the timeline before you take the quest, so you can choose to back out if you don't want spoilers. I think this solution would be an excellent way to make the most players happy. But I hope this discussion back and forth on the issues of the MSQ sort of highlights why the MSQ is such a barrier to entry, and why it isn't easily removed either. Next up, there's a Discord for that. Final Fantasy XIV, once you finish, or otherwise start deviating from the MSQ, is filled with small niches of content ranging from savage raiding to various subcategories of raiding, minimum item level no echo anyone? To glam, to housing, to field operations, to deep dungeons, to island sanctuary, to whatever else you might find. All of these types of content have communities, sometimes several smaller communities. To put it bluntly, while 14 has a feature called the Fellowship Finder, people don't really use it that much. And due to the limitations of that feature, and link shells and free communities and whatnot, communities are often instead hosted elsewhere. And most of the time, the easiest way to quickly make an easily accessible home for a community is to make a Discord server. The problem is of course that if you don't want to be part of a dozen Discord servers just for this, that is a bit of a problem. And more importantly, if you don't know that a Discord community exists, it can be incredibly difficult to learn of its existence in the first place. You're just supposed to know that a big island sanctuary community is called Overseas Casuals. But surely, that's obvious, right? I have a feeling that part of the reason why certain niches have multiple Discord communities might simply be because these communities weren't aware of each other's existence either. Where this also causes problems is that in a small enough niche, you might be convinced the content you like is actually dead and quit the game because of it, only to find that actually the reason the content appears dead is because players are congregating on a specific world different from yours and coordinate to play at specific times to make sure there are players to do the content. I'm describing Rival Wings right now. But how could you possibly know that? Would have been a lot easier if the game itself was better at representing these communities. But then let's not forget there are features in the game to do that, it's just that players don't really use them much. Long story short, 14, like many other games, especially MMOs, ends up having a huge part of the social aspect of the game housed elsewhere, like on Discord. Which can make the actual game experience, especially for new players, even more lonely. You just gotta know where the communities are, like a veteran player does. Speaking of which, an old game for veteran players. 14 is a game that gets a lot of praise for its welcoming player base, but with each day, more players hit that point where they've run a low-level duty slowly for a sprout enough times that they'd rather just hurry through it. Surely, they'll figure it out. This is further emphasized by the existence of the duty support option. If they wanted to go slow, they could go with NPC companions. Most of us also will see only so many curebot healers or tanks that never press mitigation or DPS that barely attack before it starts to get a bit grating or exhausting. Even if we realize that the reason these mistakes are happening is because these players don't actually have that many hours of playtime on the game. Each player, of course, deals with this in a different way, but it doesn't change the fact that a somewhat common observation for new players is how when they enter their first dungeon, before they can barely finish saying, "Hello," the party has blasted off to clear the duty as fast as possible. No time to look around, just go, go, go. This makes a lot more sense when we recognize that most players that land in the leveling duty probably have done it over a dozen times. They have seen what they wanted to see. But relegating new players to just do it with NPCs if you want to take it slow makes that previously mentioned lonely MSQ experience more lonely. But there isn't an easy solution to this problem either, as this problem comes as a result of the game being old and retaining players for long enough that this happens naturally. Another more high-level example of this is how scary it can be to get into hard content like Savage. A lot of the players doing this hard content have done so for years and know exactly how it's done. And while some groups might be patient with a newcomer, asking basic questions in a party for Savage content might just get you kicked, because they don't have time for that. And where do you get that basic experience then? And this expands to almost any niche that involves party content. At some point, players start to expect each other to just know, and if you're new there, where do you start? Asking the community Discord? Which is named what exactly? Find the website with all the info? Where is that located? What is its name? Just look up guides? On what exactly? Where do I start? Obviously, this kind of problem isn't exclusive to 14 either. The veteran thing isn't either. Absolutely not. What other games have over 14 in this way is that often a game focuses on a few core types of content, and so have a gradually increasing difficulty experience, where you naturally learn the things you need to know, and if you need some specific information, the players that would know to tell you would probably be randomly found as you climb the ladder. At least in the best case scenario, which isn't super duper common. In 14, however, many of these niches are small and specific enough that it can be hard to find each other in the first place, and due to how extremely tangential each piece of content is to the main meat of the game, it might be difficult to get your foot in the door to begin with. Even when it comes to the main duty content, like dungeons, trials, and raids, the difficulty spike from normal content to extremes and savage can feel so monstrous, relatively speaking, that you can't possibly know how to make that jump. For the most part, sort of just pressing buttons is enough to beat normal content. Not beat it well, mind you, but beat it. You get to extremes and suddenly there are some levels of gear expectations, knowledge about food and potions, and to some degree rotational knowledge that you had no need for before this. Which, to sort of summarize, is where we come back to barriers. If you picked up Final Fantasy XIV to have a super story-focused and very long game to play, there's probably no problem here. Whether the story is good or bad is a different conversation. But if you picked up Final Fantasy XIV to do almost anything else, then the sheer length of the MSQ can be a major hindrance, and perhaps a deal breaker, since a different game might offer a similar experience without requiring to do something else first. And then, even if you make it through this barrier to entry and make it to the content you want to do, you might be unable to find where and when people go to do the content you want to do, whether it be old Savage content, grouping up for deep dungeons, coordinating field operations, or even doing current Savage content. This problem of an ever-increasing MSQ length will of course also perpetuate more into the next expansion, Evercold, assuming nothing gets done about this. But I guess we can only wonder what will happen. Which of course leads me to ask, what do you think could help alleviate or remove these barriers to get into 14? Have you tried convincing your friends to play the game, only for them to give up because it is too long? Or I guess the more rare question, Have you managed to convince friends to play the game, and they stuck around the whole way as you continue to play with them today? I would love to hear your stories in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, in patch 5.3 of Shadowbringers, the still early days of when a certain virus locked down the world, the A Realm Reborn MSQ was shortened by about 13% by either removing entirely unnecessary quests or shortening quests to stick to the important parts. Only A Realm Reborn has received such a revision. Ever.